The peaceful suburban street erupted in chaos as Karen's luxury SUV was crushed under the weight of a massive hedge. But the true horror had only just begun. For years, she had terrorized her neighbors, especially the young widow, whose carefully tended garden was the envy of the block. Now, as sirens wailed and stunned onlookers gaped, the stakes were about to be raised in this escalating war of suburban discontent. What secrets lurked behind the manicured facades? And who would be the one to finally bring Karen's reign of terror to a devastating end? Emily stared out the kitchen window, her hands trembling as she watched the red and blue lights flashing outside. Karen's shrill voice carried across the yard, followed by the staccato barks of a police officer. This was the final showdown she had been dreading for years. It had started innocently enough, a few polite requests to trim the encroaching branches of her prized hedge. But Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, had turned a deaf ear. Instead, she used every petty bylaw in the book to torment Emily, citing her for imaginary infractions and demanding she conform to the neighborhood's rigid standards. The turning point came last week when Karen had stormed over, wielding garden shears like a weapon. "This eyesore is ruining property values," she screeched, hacking away at the thick foliage. Emily had pleaded with her to stop, but the older woman was consumed by a manic fury. By the time she was done, Emily's carefully curated hedge looked like it had been through a wood chipper. Emily had spent the next several days meticulously repairing the damage, weaving the broken branches back together and nursing the wounded plant. But she knew it was only a matter of time before Karen struck again. And that's when the idea had come to her, a plan so outrageous, so risky, that it just might work. She had spent the last 2 nights preparing, carefully arranging the components, and double-checking every detail. It was a long shot, but if it succeeded, it would send a message to Karen that she couldn't ignore. As the police officers escorted a hysterical Karen into the back of their cruiser, Emily felt a knot of tension uncoil in her stomach. She had taken a big gamble, but judging by the mangled SUV and the fuming woman being hauled away, it had paid off. Karen's reign of terror was over. Emily knew there would be consequences, but in that moment, she didn't care. For once, justice had been served, and the sweet taste of revenge was worth every risk. The next morning, Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring numbly at the newspaper headline that blared, "Bizarre Hedge Incident Lands HOA President in Jail." She had known there would be fallout, but the scope of it still caught her by surprise. Apparently, Karen's SUV had been totaled, crushed under the weight of the carefully engineered hedge trap Emily had set. The police had found surveillance footage showing Karen hacking away at the hedge mere moments before the structure collapsed, trapping her inside. Emily winced as she read the details. Karen had suffered minor injuries, but the real damage was to her reputation and her freedom. She was being charged with felony destruction of private property and could face up to 5 years in prison. The HOA had immediately voted to remove her, and now the neighborhood was in an uproar, with residents debating whether Emily's actions were justified or simply an act of petty retaliation. A loud knock at the door made Emily jump. Peering through the peephole, she saw 2 stern-faced police officers standing on her porch. Steeling herself, she opened the door. "Ma'am, we need you to come down to the station and answer a few questions," one of the officers said. "This is in regards to the incident with your neighbor's vehicle yesterday." Emily's heart raced as she nodded mutely. She knew this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Grabbing her coat, she followed the officers to their car, wondering if she had finally gone too far in her quest for justice against Karen. As they drove away, Emily glanced back at her neatly trimmed hedge, now the source of so much turmoil. Had it really been worth it? She couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret, even as a part of her savored the thought of Karen behind bars. This wasn't the ending she had envisioned, but now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The ride to the police station was tense and silent. Emily steeled herself for the interrogation, mentally rehearsing what she would say. She knew the truth would come out eventually, that Karen had been the instigator, the one who had relentlessly harassed her for years. But would anyone believe her word against the former HOA presidents? As the car pulled into the station, Emily took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Whatever happened next, she was determined to stand her ground and fight for the justice she had so painstakingly sought. The interrogation room was small and cramped, its stark fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows on Emily's face as she sat across from the two detectives. She had been waiting anxiously for over an hour, her mind racing with 1,000 possible scenarios. "All right, Ms. Johnson, let's start from the beginning," the older detective, Detective Harris, said as he flipped open a manila folder. "We've reviewed the evidence, and it paints a pretty damning picture. Your neighbor, Karen Wilkins, is claiming you deliberately sabotaged her vehicle. Care to explain your side of the story?" Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Detective, I can assure you that I never intended to harm Karen or her property. The situation between us has been contentious, to say the least, but I would never stoop to such drastic measures." The younger detective, a shrewd-looking man named Detective Rains, leaned forward. "So you're saying you had nothing to do with the hedge collapsing on her SUV?" "No, that's not what I'm saying," Emily replied, her voice steady. "I did rig the hedge, in a manner of speaking. But it was not to deliberately crush Karen's car. I was trying to protect my property from her repeated acts of vandalism." The detectives exchanged a glance, their expressions skeptical. "Vandalism, you say?" Detective Harris arched an eyebrow. "Care to elaborate?" Emily launched into a detailed account of her long-running feud with Karen, describing the HOA president's relentless harassment and the escalating incidents of property damage. She explained how Karen had hacked away at her cherished hedge, and how she had decided to devise a safeguard to prevent further destruction. "I never imagined it would go that far," Emily said, her eyes downcast. "I just wanted to send a message to show Karen that her actions had consequences. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Detective Rains studied her intently. "So you're telling us you rid your own hedge, fully aware that it could potentially collapse on someone's vehicle, as some kind of twisted revenge plot?" Emily shook her head vehemently. "No, that's not it at all. I just wanted to protect my property. I never intended for Karen to be in the car when it happened. I thought she would just get a scare, maybe have to pay for some repairs. I never meant for it to be this." Her voice trailed off as the gravity of the situation sank in. She had gone too far, and now she was facing the consequences. The detectives exchanged another pointed look, and Emily knew in that moment that convincing them of her innocence would be an uphill battle. The interrogation room felt like a pressure cooker as Emily sat in tense silence, her mind racing. The detectives had left her alone for nearly an hour, no doubt hoping the weight would wear down her resolve. But Emily was determined not to crack. She had come too far to back down now. Finally, the door opened, and Detectives Harris and Rains re-entered the room, their expressions unreadable. "Ms. Johnson, we've reviewed the evidence, and we have to say, your story is a bit hard to swallow," Detective Harris said, settling into the chair across from her. Emily's heart sank, but she refused to let it show. "I understand why you might be skeptical, Detective, but I assure you I'm telling the truth. Karen has been tormenting me for years, and I was simply trying to protect my property." "That may be so," Detective Rains interjected, "but rigging a hedge to collapse on someone's vehicle, that's a pretty extreme measure, don't you think?" "I didn't mean for it to go that far," Emily protested. "I just wanted to send a message to make her understand the consequences of her actions." The detectives exchanged another look. Then Detective Harris leaned forward, his gaze probing. "So you're admitting to intentionally sabotaging the hedge?" Emily hesitated, realizing she had just incriminated herself. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to protect my property." "Well, that's not how the evidence is shaping up," Detective Rains said, his tone heavy with disapproval. "The techs have been going over the scene, and it's clear that the hedge was deliberately reinforced and rigged to collapse at the slightest disturbance." Emily felt her stomach drop. She had been so careful, so meticulous in her planning, but somehow the police had uncovered the truth. "Ms. Johnson, we're going to have to place you under arrest," Detective Harris said, his voice grave. "You're facing charges of felony destruction of property and attempted vehicular assault. Anything you say from this point on can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the detectives rose and moved to cuff her wrists, Emily felt a wave of panic wash over her. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She had been so close to finally getting the justice she craved, and now it was all slipping through her fingers. "Wait, please," she pleaded, her composure crumbling. "You have to understand, Karen has been tormenting me for years. I was just trying to protect myself." But the detectives were unmoved, and as they led her out of the interrogation room, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. She had taken a huge risk, and now she was facing the consequences. The battle against Karen was far from over, but this time, the stakes had been raised to a dangerous new level. The local news crews were swarming outside the police station, their cameras and microphones thrust towards Emily as she was led out in handcuffs. She kept her head down, trying desperately to block out the barrage of questions being shouted in her direction. "Ms. Johnson, is it true you deliberately sabotaged your neighbor's vehicle? How long has this feud with Karen Wilkins been going on? Are you worried about the potential jail time you're facing?" Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she was shoved into the back of the squad car. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She was facing serious criminal charges, all because of her misguided attempts to fight back against Karen's relentless harassment. As the car pulled away from the chaos, Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had been so certain that her plan would work, that she would finally get the upper hand against her tormentor. But now, it seemed, the tables had turned, and she was the one facing the consequences. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a way to salvage the situation. Maybe she could convince the detectives to listen to her side of the story, to understand the context of her actions. After all, Karen had been the one to instigate this entire mess, with her constant violations of HOA rules and her blatant disregard for Emily's property. But as the car rolled on, Emily knew that convincing the authorities would be an uphill battle. The evidence against her was damning, and the optics of a homeowner deliberately sabotaging her neighbor's vehicle were not good, no matter the circumstances. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the painful reality of her predicament. Just hours ago, she had been basking in the satisfaction of watching Karen's SUV get crushed under the weight of her carefully engineered trap. Now, she was the one facing the consequences, her carefully constructed plan unraveling before her eyes. As the car pulled up to the precinct, Emily steeled herself for the long road ahead. She knew she would need to mount an aggressive legal defense, one that would not only clear her name, but also expose Karen's years of harassment and abuse. It wouldn't be easy, but Emily was determined to fight for her freedom and her reputation, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, her head held high. This battle was far from over, and she was ready to do whatever it took to come out on top. Emily sat alone in the cramped jail cell, her mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, anger, regret. They all swirled together, creating a cocktail of uncertainty as she contemplated the gravity of her situation. She had been processed, fingerprinted, and booked on charges of felony destruction of property and attempted vehicular assault. The weight of those accusations hung over her like a dark cloud, threatening to crush her resolve. As she paced the small confines of her cell, she replayed the events that had led her to this point. The years of harassment from Karen, the constant battle to maintain the pristine appearance of her home, the final, desperate act that had backfired so spectacularly. She had truly believed that her plan would work, that she would finally be able to put an end to Karen's reign of terror. But now, as the reality of her predicament sank in, Emily couldn't help but question the wisdom of her actions. Had she gone too far? Had her quest for justice blinded her to the potential consequences? A distant sound of a cell door clanging open jolted her from her thoughts, and she tensed, unsure of what was to come. Moments later, the unmistakable figure of Karen Wilkins was led into the adjoining cell, her once impeccable appearance now disheveled and her face etched with a scowl. Emily watched in stunned silence as the former HOA president paced back and forth, muttering under her breath. A small part of her felt a twinge of satisfaction, knowing that Karen was now facing the consequences of her own actions. But the larger part of her was consumed by a growing sense of dread, realizing that their personal feud had spiraled out of control, dragging them both into a legal quagmire. As the minutes ticked by in the eerie silence of the jail, Emily's mind drifted to the uncertain future that lay ahead. Would she be able to mount a successful defense? Would the court see the nuances of her story, the years of torment that had driven her to such desperate measures? Or would she be condemned as a villain, a reckless vigilant who had taken the law into her own hands? The weight of the unknown pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. But even in the darkest moments, a glimmer of determination flickered within her. She hadn't come this far to give up without a fight. If she could just find a way to tell her story, to expose the true nature of her conflict with Karen, perhaps she could still emerge from this ordeal with her freedom and her reputation intact. With a deep breath, Emily straightened her posture, her eyes fixed on the cell door. She was ready to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension as Emily took the stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent countless hours with her attorney, meticulously crafting her defense, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of the moment. As she recounted the years of harassment at the hands of Karen Wilkins, her voice wavered with a mixture of emotion and conviction. She described the endless barrage of petty violations, the relentless citations, and the blatant disregard for her property rights. And finally, she detailed the fateful day when Karen had taken a pair of garden shears to her beloved Hedge, an act of wanton destruction that had driven Emily to her desperate plan. The prosecutor, a stern-faced woman with a reputation for being ruthless, listened intently, her brow furrowed in a perpetual scowl. Emily could feel the weight of her gaze, the silent challenge to prove the validity of her claims. "So you're telling this court that you deliberately rigged your own hedge to collapse on Ms. Wilkins' vehicle, purely as an act of self-defense?" the prosecutor asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes meeting the woman's unwavering stare. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I never intended to harm Karen or her property. I was simply trying to protect what was rightfully mine, to send a message that her constant harassment and vandalism would no longer be tolerated." The prosecutor paced the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "And you honestly expect the jury to believe that? That you didn't have any malicious intent, that you were simply an innocent victim caught up in a neighborhood dispute?" Emily's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles turning white. "I know it may sound far-fetched, but I assure you I am telling the truth. Karen Wilkins has been tormenting me for years, and I reached a point where I felt I had no other choice but to take action." The courtroom erupted in a flurry of murmurs, and Emily could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes bearing down on her. This was her moment, her chance to set the record straight and reclaim the narrative that had spiraled so far out of control. As the prosecutor prepared to launch her next salvo, Emily steeled herself, determined to stand her ground. She had come too far to back down now. Whatever the outcome, she was going to fight for her freedom and her reputation with every fiber of her being. The courtroom was hushed as the jury filed back into the room, their faces etched with a solemn determination. Emily sat rigidly in the witness box, her heart pounding in her ears as she waited for the verdict that would determine the course of her life. After what felt like an eternity, the foreman rose, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling on the judge. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice measured and calm. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. "On the charges of felony destruction of property and attempted vehicular assault, we find the defendant, Emily Johnson, not guilty." The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps and murmurs, but Emily remained frozen, her mind struggling to process the words she had just heard. Not guilty. After all the weeks of intense cross-examination, the relentless attack on her character, the jury had seen the truth in her story. She glanced over at Karen, whose face had drained of color, her eyes wide with disbelief. The former HOA president had been found guilty on multiple counts of harassment and property damage, a decisive victory that seemed to reverberate through the halls of the courthouse. As the judge banged his gavel, restoring order to the courtroom, Emily finally allowed herself to breathe. She had fought hard, putting everything on the line, and now she had emerged victorious. The nightmare was over, and she could finally reclaim her life, her home, and her sense of peace. As she exited the courtroom, surrounded by a swarm of reporters and onlookers, Emily couldn't help but feel a profound sense of relief. The road had been long and arduous, but she had stayed true to herself, refusing to be cowed by the weight of the charges or the relentless efforts of the prosecution. Now, as she stepped out into the sunlight, she knew that the true victory lay not in the courtroom, but in the reclamation of her dignity and the restoration of the life she had fought so hard to protect. Karen's reign of terror was over, and Emily was ready to move forward, her head held high and her heart filled with a newfound sense of empowerment. It had been a long and harrowing journey, but in the end, justice had prevailed. Emily knew that the scars of this battle would never fully heal, but she also knew that she had the strength to overcome any challenge that life might throw her way. She was ready to embrace the future, confident in the knowledge that she had emerged from the darkness stronger and more resilient than ever before.